Welcome back, Bio30 Prep. We're going to start our last topic for this course, and that is the muscular system. In your textbook, it's pages 331 to 342. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to describe the three types of muscle tissue. You'll be able to describe the processes involved in a muscle during a muscle contraction, and you'll be able to identify the sources of energy for a muscle contraction. So in our body, there are actually three types of muscle. A skeletal muscle is the muscle we're most familiar with. It's the muscle of your biceps, your triceps. When you think of muscle, bodybuilders, this is the muscle that you think about when you think about muscle. In terms of its cellular organization, the cells are tubular and striated. The striations are little lines found in the muscle cell. And tubular, they're long tubes that stretch along the length of the muscle. Each muscle, unlike what we consider maybe in a normal cell, has many nuclei. Most cells only have one nucleus. These cells have many nuclei all the way down each tube. They can be very long. Each cell can be up to 20 centimeters long, and they are controlled by voluntary muscle contractions. So these are the muscles where you have to think about using them before they'll do anything. So these are the muscles of your leg, your arms, your chest. These are the muscles that you think about using every day when you think about muscles. Smooth muscle is a little bit different. They are long and they have a single nucleus. So like most cells, they only have one nucleus instead of many in each cell. They're arranged in parallel sheets as opposed to tubes. And in terms of where you find them, this is the only type of muscle that we've really talked about during this course. They're found on blood vessels, on your alimentary canal. These are the muscles that constrict arterioles or allow access to capillary beds. On the bronchioles, these are the things that can keep the bronchioles open. There's all that muscle that wraps around these tubes in our body. These are all smooth muscle. They're controlled by involuntary contractions, which means we don't think about them. They're automatic. Most of them are going to be controlled by your medulla oblongata, which is part of your brain. The last type of muscle is cardiac muscle, and we talked a little bit about cardiac muscle during the circulatory system. We said it was the one type of muscle that can contract without nerve stimulation. It's kind of a mix between the two. It's tubular and striated. It's relatively short compared to the other two muscle types, and it's also branched. So it's a much different shape than your typical skeletal muscle or your smooth muscle. Each cell only has a single nuclei or a single nucleus. Look at that, horrible. Single nucleus. Again, controlled by involuntary contractions. We don't control our heart rate by thinking about it. It's controlled by our brain without us having to think about it, which is probably a good thing. You wouldn't want to forget about, making your heart beat every once in a while. So yeah, those are the three types of muscle in your body. These next two lectures are going to focus mostly on skeletal muscles. So how do skeletal muscles work? How do they contract? And how do they get energy for muscle contraction? So skeletal muscles are important for body support. They keep us upright and oppose gravity. They help us with bone movement. So muscle contractions cause all bones to move. None of the bones in our body can move just by themselves. Think about them pretty much as being just a bunch of rocks almost. The only way to move them is to have them attached to a muscle and have the muscle contract and lift that bone up from where it was before. They also control organ movement. For example, our eyes, that we move them left, right, up, and down in circles. Also the iris of our eye, the thing that opens and closes to let light in, those are controlled by muscles. They help us maintain body temperature. Every time we go to make ATP, that molecule that provides energy for our body, it requires a breakdown of glucose. This here is glucose. Hopefully you recognize the formula by now. As we break it down, we get energy. Some of it makes ATP. The rest of it is lost to the rest of our body as heat. So one way we're able to keep warm is simply by metabolizing sugar. The other thing skeletal muscle does, is it protects our organs and stabilizes joints. So it acts as padding to absorb shock, and it also maintains articulation between joints. Or another way to say this is this makes sure that our bones are aligned properly. There we go, aligned properly. So how does skeletal muscle work? All skeletal muscles, there are 600 skeletal muscles in the body. We don't have to memorize any names. It doesn't hurt to know where the bicep and tricep is, but most of us would do anyways. Other than that, in terms of muscle names, we're not going to worry about it. The neat thing about muscles is they always shrink when they contract. So muscles only pull on bones, they don't ever push. This means that all muscles have to work in pairs, and here they use the arm as an example, the forearm. If we want to move our forearm up, we contract our bicep muscle. So by contracting our bicep muscle, it pulls on the two bones in our forearm, the radius and the ulna, and pulls those bones up towards our face. If we want to straighten our arm out, this bicep muscle can't push on the bones that it's connected to, so there's no pushing force this way. What has to happen instead is our tricep muscle contracts. So our tricep muscle, the muscle on the back of our upper arm or the back of our humerus, it contracts, pulling our arm out. As it's contracting, the biceps relax. So muscles work in pairs for almost every muscle that, or for every muscle that pulls a bone in one direction, there's another muscle that's going to pull the bone in the other direction. And that works for our arms, our legs, even our ribs. Now, the structure of skeletal muscle, and you can see here on the right, there's a little hierarchy that's shown. A muscle is an organ surrounded by connective tissue composed of connective tissue and composed of several other tissues, such as bundles of muscle cells and nervous tissue. So inside of a muscle, there's a whole bunch of different type of tissue. There's muscle tissue, there's connective tissue, blood is flowing through our muscles to provide it with ATP and nutrients. There's also nerve tissue and epithelial tissue as well. The muscle cells in these bundles are called muscle fibers. So each cell is called a fiber as opposed to just a cell. And what we're going to find out is that there's some special names for muscle cells. I can't tell you why they're there, but for the organelles inside of our muscles, there are different names for the organelles. So these muscle fibers can be up to 20 centimeters in length, and they contain many nuclei. The organelles within them have unique names. The cell membrane is called the sarcolemma. The endoplasmic reticulum, or the ER, is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and cytoplasm is known as sarcoplasm. So a little bit of new memorization. And in terms of the composition of a muscle, this picture over here on the right is when you want to memorize. A muscle is what we think about. This would be your bicep or your tricep. It's made up of bundles of cells, so muscle fiber bundles. These bundles are, of course, made of muscle fiber. This is the cells. The myofibrils are bundles of proteins inside of each cell. And the myofilaments are the actual proteins. And it turns out that this is what we're going to be spending our time talking about. It's the functional unit of our muscle, or it's the level, or it's these proteins interacting that cause our muscles to contract. Here's a picture of what we were just talking about in terms of organization. Here we have, it looks like a femur and our pelvis, and here's some connective tissue. Here's a tendon that's attached to a muscle. And what you're going to see is that the structure of skeletal muscle, there's bundles of muscle fibers. Each fiber is surrounded by connective tissue. Each bundle, is surrounded by connective tissue, and then each fiber is also surrounded by connective tissue. And as you can see, each fiber is supplied with blood vessels and nervous tissue. And here we have a myofibril, which is a bundle of proteins. And here we have the myofilaments, which are the proteins that actually make our muscles contract. So what's going to happen is at this level here, this is going to be the level of muscle contraction. As millions and millions of these start to contract, the whole muscle starts to shrink in size or shrink in length. So each fiber is composed of hundreds of thousands of subunits called myofibrils, which are made up of finer units called myofilaments, and these are the structural unit responsible for muscle contractions. There are two types of myofilaments that we have to know. One is called actin, one is called myosin. The actin microfilament resembles two strands of beads twisted together. The myosin myofilament resembles bundles of strings twisted together, almost like a braid, and at the end of each string is this little head sticking out. Now when these two proteins interact, here's the way they're set up. So it starts off in a relaxed muscle. So when the muscle isn't doing anything, the myosin heads are just up and almost touching the actin thread. When the muscle flexes, that actin or that myosin head is going to push along the actin filaments, and then ATP is going to cause the release of the myosin head. So myosin pushes along that actin filament, ATP makes it release and relax, and then it can grab hold and push again. And so it's a series of these that causes a muscle to contract. This is the sliding filament muscle. Sliding filament model. So the myosin head flexes backward and inward, pulling on the actin myofilament. The actin myofilament is pulled in direction of the flex. And these myosin heads, one way to think about it is they walk up the myosin strand. So they grab hold, push along it, let go, grab hold, push along it, let go. Each myosin head uses one ATP molecule to relax the head, repositioning it further down the strand of actin. So here is kind of a bigger picture of what's going to happen for a muscle contraction. And what we can see is inside each muscle fiber, there are these bundles of myofilaments, and inside these bundles are Z lines. So think of them as anchoring points on either side, and attached to these anchors are long actin strands. In the middle of them are bundles of myosin. So in a relaxed muscle, what you can see is the head of the myosin strand up close to, but not quite touching, the actin strand. As the muscle flex, these myosin heads are going to push along the actin strand. So they're going to grab the actin strand and they're going to push it in this way. On the other side, the same thing happens. There's a push along the actin strand, and what that does is it brings the Z lines closer together. And this is the contraction of a muscle. So as these Z lines get closer and closer and closer, it causes the muscle to shrink in terms of its length. So actin myosin myofilaments between two Z lines function to create a muscle contraction. A muscle fiber consists of millions of these functional units strung out end to end along the length of a muscle fiber. So what you'd see is inside here we have a Z line and a Z line, and then there's one strand of actin myosin. They're going to get pulled this way. We're going to have another one right beside it, another Z line here, and it would get pulled in the same sort of direction. So all of these Z lines are getting pulled closer and closer together, causing the muscle to shrink. Now we got to talk about, well, how does this all happen? There's a whole bunch of players in terms of how to make a muscle contract. If we didn't have a way of controlling it, our muscles would start contracting for no reason, and that wouldn't be a good thing. Or the muscle wouldn't contract at all when we wanted to, and that would be just as bad. So the myofilaments are found in the sarcoplasm, and remember, sarcoplasm is the same as cytoplasm inside of a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. In a relaxed myofilament, the myosin heads are bent up and almost touching the actin, but they're not quite attached. The attachment sites are blocked by another protein called tropomyosin. So tropomyosin is another protein. It's blocking the attachment between myosin and actin. When the muscle is about to contract, there's another protein called troponin. It's going to bind to the tropomyosin and pull it off of these binding sites. What causes that troponin to pull on the tropomyosin? The answer, calcium ions. So when we want to flex our muscle, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is the same as endoplasmic reticulum, just we call it sarcoplasmic because we're inside of a muscle cell, releases calcium ions into the cell. The calcium ions bind to the troponin, causing it to bind to the tropomyosin, pulling it away from the binding sites, allowing actin and myosin to bind. How's that for complicated? It works better in a picture. Here we have myosin, the actin as we saw before, and what you can see is along the actin is this long blue thread. The long blue thread is that tropomyosin protein. Attached to it are troponin molecules. So in a relaxed muscle, and you can kind of see these little beige spots in between the blue tropomyosin and the green actin beads, those are the binding sites. So in a relaxed muscle, those binding sites are blocked, myosin is not going to latch on, and our muscle is not going to flex. When we want to flex our muscles, calcium ions are released into the myofilament. They bind to the troponin pulls on the tropomyosin, opening up those binding sites. So you can see along this picture here, all the binding sites are freed up, allowing for myosin to grab hold and pull on the actin strand. So the energy for all of this, or the energy, the ATP, and remember, I'm just going to go back one slide here. These myosin heads are going to pull on the actin strand, but in order for them to pop back off, we have to have ATP to release myosin and actin. Without ATP, that muscle would actually stay contracted. It would be held in a contracted state. There'd be no way for it to, or in a partially contracted state at least, there'd be no way for those myosin heads to release. So we need energy to pull them off. It turns out that in our body stores very little ATP, only enough ATP for a few seconds of activity. Now, most of us can do more than a few seconds of activity, so there has to be a way of generating ATP while we're being active. And there are three ways to get our ATP. There's the breakdown of creatine phosphate, and the reaction for it. Creatine phosphate's a large molecule. We won't worry about the actual atoms that are in it, but creatine phosphate will break into creatine, phosphate, and an ATP molecule. The other way, the more common way, or I shouldn't say the more common way, but the next way to get ATP is through aerobic respiration. This is the metabolism of glucose, or oxidation of glucose. When we do that, so here's our glucose molecule. When we oxidize it, we get 36 ATP, roughly, from each glucose molecule. That gives us energy to move our muscles. The final way is lactate fermentation. Notice we start with glucose again, but this time it doesn't get broken down all the way. It gets broken down into lactic acid. Notice that it doesn't give us anywhere near as much energy as when we oxidize it with oxygen. The method for ATP production is dependent on oxygen availability. Obviously, if we take a look at these bottom two reactions, the better of the two has to be aerobic respiration. It provides way more energy from a glucose molecule. It only happens when we have oxygen molecules. In lactate fermentation, notice there's nothing reacting with our glucose, nothing to help break it down and get that energy out of it. So for acquiring ATP, creatine phosphate plus ADP gives us creatine and ATP. So what happens is our body is actually storing creatine phosphate. It's used first, it gives us about 8 seconds worth of energy, and it's built up in resting muscles. So in our resting muscles we have about 8 seconds of easy energy stored in them. It's most easily accessed, and it's stored around the myofilaments, and it reaccumulates by the reverse reaction. So when we're resting or after we're done exercising, this reverse reaction is going to happen, and we're going to build up our creatine phosphate again. Then when we're active, we get about 8 seconds of creatine phosphate, and then we have to find energy some other way. The next way is the metabolism of glucose, or the breaking down of glucose in the presence of oxygen. Here's our oxygen molecules. This gives us a whole bunch of ATP, so it's got to be the primary source of ATP production. It occurs in the mitochondria of our muscle fiber cells. Our muscles also store glycogen. Remember, glycogen is a carbohydrate. That carbohydrate can be turned into glucose, and then the glucose is used for ATP. Our muscles also store a special molecule called myoglobin. This name should sound somewhat familiar because it is similar to hemoglobin, and it stores oxygen in our muscle tissue. So our muscles, because we need energy often right away for our muscles, especially if we're going to be using them for running, or to use a lot of energy quickly, we actually store oxygen in our muscle cells. It's attached to another protein called myoglobin. Also, heat from this reaction helps maintain our internal body temperature. So as we move our muscles, we're burning up sugar. As we burn up that sugar, it produces heat, and that's what keeps our bodies warm. That's one of the reasons why when you're somewhere cold and you start to shiver, shivering is basically little muscle contractions. As those muscle contractions happen, we generate heat, and that keeps our body warm. The final method of breaking down or of getting ATP is lactate fermentation. This happens when the circulatory system cannot keep up with oxygen demand. So if you've been exercising for a long time, and this depends on physical fitness, but the longer you exercise, the more you're going to be using up your oxygen stores in your body. At some point, your body is not going to be able to provide enough oxygen to your muscle cells to oxidize the sugar, or to break that sugar down and get lots of energy out of it. If this happens, then this fermentation reaction takes place. Fermentation, it's similar to the fermentation of alcohol, only it's a fermentation of sugar. It's a fermentation of glucose. This produces lactic acid. Lactic acid is this molecule here, the C3CH6O3. That's our lactic acid. And it builds up in our muscles. Notice it's an acid, and so it's going to lower the pH in our muscle cells. As that pH lowers, it's going to affect all of those proteins that are working in our body, right? Lower pH affects the function of proteins, or affects the function of enzymes. And after about 5 minutes of lactate fermentation, the muscle tissue becomes too acidic for the proteins to function properly. And this is when you're going to get a muscle cramp. So those muscles cramping are caused by acidity building up in our muscles. We've used up all of our oxygen storage. We start doing lactate fermentation. After about 5 minutes of lactate fermentation, that's it. Our muscles can't do, or can't relax, because we can't get enough energy released from the glucose. A lack of ATP is going to make it harder for the muscles to relax, because that calcium ion can't be pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Or another way of looking at it is those myosin and actin bonds stay stuck together. So the muscle's contracted, and there isn't any energy to break those bonds. So oxygen deficit is a term for the buildup of lactic acid. Lactate fermentation creates an oxygen deficit, or basically, as we go through our lactate fermentation, we start to build up these C3 H6O3 molecules. The longer we exercise with oxygen not being provided to our muscles, the more of that stuff gets built up. Now the nice thing is, muscle cells are one of the few cells that can create large oxygen deficits and still function. They can withstand a large pH change compared to other cells in our body. Our brain cells can't do it. Our brain cells have to do oxidative or the oxidation of glucose in order to get their energy. If lactate fermentation starts to happen in our brain cells, they start to get damaged and brain death occurs. They can't handle having a lot of lactic acid built up in their cells. Muscle cells can. Once our strenuous exercise is over, remember this lactate fermentation doesn't happen until we've done strenuous exercise. Once the exercise is over, that lactate is converted back into something called pyruvate, which is not something we really need to worry about, but that pyruvate is then metabolized completely. And I'm going to cross out the word remember. This is for those Bio 20 people. In Bio 20, and if you're curious, this is Chapter 5 in your inquiry textbook, but it talks about cellular respiration in detail, and these are the processes that each cell has to go through. So in cellular respiration, there's a process called glycolysis, and then there's a molecule called acetyl-CoA that transports something, and so on and so on. This is how the ATP is generated. We don't need to know it. If you're curious, you can check out Chapter 5 in your textbook. Otherwise, I wouldn't worry about it. So the creatine phosphate is used to is synthesized using ATP. So a couple of things happen as the glucose is metabolized. The first thing that's going to happen is the creatine phosphate supply gets built back up, and then we can actually start metabolizing the glucose to produce ATP. So that's the general idea of how a muscle contracts. The body consists of 3 types of muscle tissue. In all 3 types of tissue, it's the same basic process. We just focused on how it would look in a skeletal muscle. There's also smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscle is structured as bundles of muscle fibers, which are cells, so bundles of muscle cells, which in turn are composed of bundles of myofilaments. The myofilaments are the structures responsible for muscle contraction. They're composed primarily of axin and myosin. The sliding filament model describes how actin and myosin move along each other to cause a muscle contraction in the presence of calcium ions. Creatine phosphate and glucose are the 2 primary sources of energy for a muscle contraction. So that's where the glucose is where the energy comes from. The myoglobin is muscle's special storage molecule for oxygen. Because muscles use a lot of energy, especially when you compare them to other organs in our body, they use lots and lots of energy. They need to have oxygen around so that they can work for longer periods of time. They store that oxygen in a molecule called myoglobin. And that's almost the end of our course. We have one more lecture left, talking about muscles.